Château de Thoiry is a zoo that is located just a few miles away from Paris, France. It's one of very few parks in Europe that doesn't just protect and reintroduce animals into their natural habitats, but they also offer a rather unique experience for visitors that Europeans don't usually get to have. For one, they can take rides across the park in buggies and jeeps, just like you would in African safaris. And they have very swanky chalets with huge viewing windows so that guests can see the bucks and gazelles roam around in the wilderness. The dangerous animals, however, can be viewed up close from transparent tunnels that allow viewers to see the lions, tigers, and leopards at eye level. Not all of the park is accessible to people. Predators like cheetahs and Komodo dragons have their own fenced-in enclosures, but a big chunk of the park has open forests that contain bears, wolves, and lynxes. That section of the park is called the American exhibit, and it emulates the forests of Northern America, including the animals that would naturally reside there. Tour groups are taken there in armored jeeps at scheduled intervals. This is not the kind of zoo where you just walk around unattended. If you are not viewing the animals from the dome tunnels, then you are riding from one place to the other under the supervision of a guide. Even those renting chalets have guides patrolling the areas constantly. Thoiry really has tried to think of every single thing they can do to keep people and animals safe. That is, as long as the people comply with the rules. Since there are still court proceedings tied to this incident, we will have to refer to the 37-year-old woman by a pseudonym, Marie. Her mother and her 2-year-old son arrived on Saturday morning in late June 2024. The day went exactly as planned. Marie's son liked the reptile house most of all, and they saw every enclosure that you could visit from the safety of the tunnels. They'd paid for one night in the chalets, but not for any of the safari-style tours in the jeeps. So it's possible that Marie wasn't aware that the park had a free-range area where animals were not kept in enclosures, which seems a bit odd, since they specifically requested that their chalet be inside the American exhibit, as they were hoping to see a bear or some wolves from the safety of their chalet. Maybe Marie thought that the pathways were meant for people as well as the jeeps that used it. Whatever the case may be, Marie made a very strange decision the next morning. After getting a good night's sleep and even seeing a pure white Arctic wolf and 2 lynxes from their windows, they had scheduled for a jeep to escort them out of the park later that morning. But Marie decided that since she was in such a gorgeous slice of nature, she wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by to take a long jog among the trees. So, leaving her son with her mother, she set out in her running shorts, running all the way to where the pathway ended. The wide road narrowed to a thin path, obviously meant for people to go on foot. The rangers did occasionally use these dirt roads on foot, but it was only meant for the armed staff of the zoo, just like the dozen signs that Marie passed proclaimed. But Marie, probably distracted by the trees and keeping her breathing under control, didn't notice the warning signs at all. She just went into the tree line and kept jogging, her head still on where her feet were going. Marie nearly ran right into a fully grown bear. Marie came to a dead stop, her heart pounding in her chest. The animal was so surprised at the woman's sudden appearance that it stared at her with almost as much shock as Marie had staring at it. Slowly, without taking her eyes off the bear, Marie began to backtrack, praying that she didn't trip on a rock as she went backwards. But Marie didn't notice another animal behind her, a female Arctic wolf. It had been following her for several yards already. This wolf wasn't alone. Hidden in the trees behind her was her mate and her almost fully grown cub, too. All of them were waiting for a moment in which they could attack. Humans are not natural prey to them, and they weren't keen to just go charging at something so alien to them. But now that she had come to a standstill, all of their trepidation disappeared, and the lead female darted across the forest floor, coming in from behind Marie. Marie, whose eyes were still ahead of her, didn't see it coming until the female wolf latched onto her ankle. The animal tried to yank her feet out from under her, but Marie managed to stay on her feet as she screamed at the top of her lungs. She tried to kick the animal with her free foot, but it barely flinched when she struck it. The other two wolves came leaping from the tree line, and those white bolts of fur were enough to scare away the bear in front of Marie. It wanted nothing to do with this hunt, that's for sure. Marie caught the other two wolves coming at her and turned to shield her face just in time. The male landed on her back, and the younger one grabbed one of her arms. Marie's panicked screams reached the ears of two rangers who just happened to be at the trailhead doing their rounds. It took them seconds to reach the scene. By then, Marie, with 3 wolves on top of her, was at the bottom of the raging wolves, pinning her down on her stomach. The female had dislocated her ankle and had nearly ripped her foot completely off. The young one was pulling at her left arm, tearing the muscle and skin to shreds. But it was the male who had the most advantage. It had Marie by the throat. The position wasn't ideal to get to her main artery, but it knew instinctively that if it held on long enough, she would eventually suffocate or bleed out. The wolves shook their heads viciously, sending flecks of blood flying everywhere. Their stark white fur was already drenched in blood, and if Marie wasn't still screaming so loudly, you'd have thought she must be dead from all the blood she'd lost. The 2 men ran right at them, not even bothering to grab their radios to call for help. There was no time. They had mere seconds before Marie succumbed to the mauling of the 3 wolves on top of her. Swearing and shouting, they descended on the pack like they had no fear for themselves at all. And it's that overly dramatic display of confidence that got the wolves' attention. Just like they were curious about attacking Marie in the first place, so were they about taking on 2 fully grown humans. They tore their teeth out of the various places that they'd been latched onto and fled into the trees, leaving Marie in a bloody, moaning, and tattered heap. One ranger picked her up, cradling her like a child, and ran back to the jeep, while the other finally got the chance to radio in for help. By the time they arrived at the entrance, the ambulance was only 10 minutes away, and the staff, all trained in first aid, were able to keep her stable. Marie's eyes were rolled into the back of her head, and she was unresponsive, but still breathing when emergency services arrived. For the first 3 days in the hospital, her condition was such that the doctors weren't sure if she was going to make it. They'd managed to reattach the foot, and her arm had hundreds of stitches, but it was the throat that concerned them most. Marie had lost so much blood that she was in a coma for the first 2 days, and when she finally woke up, she was kept precariously still. If she so much as coughed, the stitches in her throat would rip loose, and she'd bleed out faster than they could get her into an operating room. It was a full week after the horrifying attack when complications happened after an infection in her reattached foot. Her body was rejecting the doctor's operations, and after a week and a half in a coma, Marie passed away. But if you thought the attack itself was dramatic, it's nothing compared to the drama that followed since then. Marie's family filed a lawsuit against the zoo. They say that there were no warning signs on the trail or the road at all, and that there was no clear indication that the public were not allowed to roam free. The park, on the other hand, has already proved that there were at least 7 signs on the route that Marie was jogging along. But her family's lawyers argued that the signs were too small, that the plain green script on them were not the proper color to draw a passerby's eyes to warn them of the danger. No warning symbols or bright red and yellow lettering that usually used to indicate danger was visible at all. This case has barely started, and it's already looking like it's going to be a drawn-out affair, with the zoo placing the blame on Marie and Marie's family placing the blame on the zoo. Who do you think is responsible for her terrifying final affliction? The case we're going to cover today is an enigma, a mystery, because even though 3 people in total were attacked, we still don't know exactly what animal it was that is to blame. It all started off the coast of Mexico, just as the December of 2023 began. 26-year-old Maria Jimenez was killed by a shark while swimming with her friends and family. We can be certain that it was a shark because there were witnesses to the attack, but the species is still unknown. Less than a week later, 500 miles away, in the Ixtapa-Zihuatanejo resort, 2 attacks, just 2 days apart, took place. With Maria's death still hot in the news, and the fact that the attacks happened in the ocean, it was just assumed that it was a shark too, probably the same one that killed Maria. But that might not be the case at all. The first attack at Ixtapa occurred when another young woman was swimming. Basking in the shallows, she was grabbed by the leg under the cloudy water. The other holiday-goers grabbed her arms when she began screaming in pain, and they saw the crimson water. Whatever grabbed her did so much damage that doctors briefly considered amputating the leg entirely, but luckily they were able to patch up her shattered and torn leg. When she woke up, she remembered something very important. Even though she hadn't seen what had bitten her, she was adamant that this was no shark. When the creature rammed into her, it felt like it was made of jagged rock, not at all the hard or leathery skin that sharks have. Her hands showed the evidence of the sharp edges that she'd managed to grab onto during the brief struggle. They were scratched and raw. Sharks have smooth skin, but crocodiles, well, they resemble rock more than anything else. Their scales aren't as smooth as other reptiles are. Those scales can rip through flesh like a serrated knife would. The doctors who treated her agreed. The bites looked more like a crocodile than a shark, but the leg was so terribly ripped and torn that it was hard to make a definitive call, and crocodiles do sometimes manage to make it into the salt water. Heavy rains and plain old bad luck lead the fearsome lizards into the ocean, though they almost always make it back to the freshwater streams in a few days. Confused and out of place, they rarely hunt in the salt water, but it wouldn't be the first time that they did. Or it could have been the Morales crocodiles, a very unique species of crocodile that have adapted to living in the salt waters of Mexico. These beasts don't grow as large as their freshwater cousins, but their snouts are broader, their bite is stronger, and they run faster on land, making them every bit as dangerous as the other species, and in some ways, even more so. And now we get to the 14th of December, with most people still thinking it was a shark that attacked the unnamed woman, thanks to Maria's death just a few days before. But the news of the second victim hadn't spread quite as far and wide as aquatic attacks usually do. The woman survived. Witnesses couldn't define what creature had attacked her, and subsequently, with so little to go on, there just wasn't as much publicity as there should have been. That day, a Belgian tourist named Joseph Bijnens, aged 75, was swimming lazily off in the distance. The late morning was warm, and almost everyone had gotten out of the water to avoid the direct heat of the midday sun that was fast approaching. Marlene Luviano was one of those that decided to stay on the beach, playing at the edges of the waves with her 3-year-old daughter. Marlene and her father had taken the little girl to the resort to celebrate her birthday, since she loved the water so much, and Mr. Luviano was recording every moment on his cell phone. Just ahead of the happy little family, Joseph was still taking his leisurely swim, and he crossed into Mr. Luviano's video footage. Joseph felt a sudden snap around his calf and knee. Before he could even register what was happening, he was pulled under the water, but the bite was shallow and the animal's teeth ripped through Joseph's flesh, allowing him to break free and surface again. Joseph managed to scream. The sound was muted by the water that had flooded into his mouth, but it was enough for the Luvianos to look up from their game. Mr. Luviano had caught Joseph's sudden submersion, his reappearance, and his desperate cry for help on camera. Just as Marlene pulled her daughter away from the danger and her father turned off the camera, the beachgoers swarmed into the water to help the elderly man in distress. They thought he had gotten tired and was in danger of drowning, but when he disappeared beneath the surf again, yanked like a string, and the bloody redness that took his place in the waves, they knew that this was no drowning. This was something much, much worse. The splashing of the approaching horde of no less than 8 men rushing to the scene made the animal release its hold on Joseph's leg. It sank down deep and fled back into the safety of the deeper ocean. The crowd pulled Joseph out, but it was too late. In less than a minute, he'd been bitten twice. The second strike was so fierce that what little was left of his right leg was hanging on by a few strands of sinew. By the time he was carried out onto the sand, the severed leg wasn't even bleeding anymore. There simply was no more blood left in him to spend. Just 50 seconds was all it took to take Joseph's life, with all of his life's blood spilled from his body. No amount of CPR, transfusions, or anything that the paramedics did on their way to the hospital, nothing could bring him back. No matter how quickly they arrived or how hard they tried, Joseph was gone, and all he left behind was the video evidence of just how quickly and silently a person can be taken from this world by the monsters that live beneath the surface. And if you're wondering, the creature hasn't struck since, further deepening the belief that it was indeed a saltwater crocodile. Sharks have a habit of coming back to good hunting grounds, while the aquatic lizards are not so bound to a single place. If the hunting isn't fruitful enough, they'll move on. And Joseph's wounds, too, were consistent with a crocodile bite that could not have been less than 3 meters long. It's still out there somewhere, waiting to bring another unsuspecting swimmer to their terrifying final affliction. Prahlad Gujar was a bit of a man-child. Now in his late 30s, he'd never bothered to marry or really do a great deal to work himself up at the Rajasthan municipality where he worked as a member of the maintenance crew. It's not that Prahlad was necessarily a bad guy. He'd just always been a little unfocused on moving forward, with a lot more interest in having fun and enjoying life. We all know someone like him, and for all his lack of drive, he was actually a pleasant individual who made friends easily. Prahlad was the life of the party, and he made a point of having a good time every weekend. And when he did get some time off, he'd rather join in on a good party than to visit his rather traditional and stern family in the southern point of India. That was exactly the case in February 2024. He was supposed to take the week off to attend his niece's wedding, but Prahlad decided instead to lie to his parents and siblings, saying that he never managed to get the week off. But he was, in fact, cleared for the short holiday, and he was planning on spending it with some buddies, painting the town red. And oh boy, did they have a good time. From sunup to sundown, the group of overgrown man-children visited the parks and rivers. For 5 days, from Monday to Friday, they spent the day in good spirits, slept wherever there was room for them at night, only to get up the next morning to do it all over again. One by one, the friends dropped off. They just didn't have the stamina to keep up with the hard partying, until Saturday, when Prahlad got up and it was only him who was left on the booze brigade. He hopped around the local bars looking for any familiar faces and working up a good buzz before noon. Eventually, he had to accept that all of his buddies had faded out, but that didn't bother Prahlad too much. He had enough beer in him to go out and have fun without them. Prahlad was much more inebriated than anyone realized. The woman at the ticket booth didn't even notice any unsteadiness or unusual behavior from him. Sri Venkateswara Zoological Park regularly showed drunk visitors away at the entrance gates, keeping the place as family-friendly as possible. Had they seen any unusual behavior from him, he would have been shown the door before he could even step foot inside the park. It didn't take Prahlad long to get bored of the monkeys and the gazelles. He began to wander off to the predator enclosures, but the bears and the smaller cats were just as uneventful for him. Prahlad did take a few selfies of himself in front of the cages to send off to his friends to show them what they were missing out on. And when he got no replies from any of them, he decided to up the ante a little. He went straight for the lion enclosures. In the main path, a male lion and his lioness were on display for park visitors. Prahlad got up right to their fence line to get a better picture with them. A security guard rushed forward and chased him away. The signs were clear as day. No one was allowed to get within 8 feet of the wire that kept them safe from the animals. The security guard was not as easily fooled as the lady at the entrance was. He immediately realized that Prahlad was going to be trouble. Sanji dealt with teenage hooligans, attention-seeking social media influencers, and drunkards every day. He could spot a troublemaker a mile away. Prahlad just couldn't shake the tail. That guard made sure that he kept Prahlad in his sights from the moment he chased him away from the first cage. But Prahlad had other ideas. Just behind the first cage, almost completely hidden from view, was another. This enclosure was not for the public to visit. It was where new arrivals that needed to get used to the environment were placed, or animals that were sick or injured. Again, the signs were clear. Only staff were allowed to even go down the path that led to the temporary housing unit, never mind go to the cage itself. Prahlad waited until the guard's attention was subverted by another visitor who was asking for directions. He took off running before the guard could turn back around. Right next to the holding stood a large water tank that supplied the cages in the nearby vicinity. Prahlad climbed it, getting himself high enough to look 12 feet down into the space where 2 lionesses and a fully grown male lion lay baking in the sun. The guard turned back just in time to see Prahlad on top of the tank, and he immediately grabbed his radio calling for backup as he ran full speed at the mad man on top of the water tank. Prahlad, laughing with glee, jumped straight down without a second thought, landing squarely in between the 3 lions, with his phone in his hand, ready to snap a picture of 2 before the guards could remove him from the cage. What happened next shouldn't surprise any of you. The male lion immediately pounced on Prahlad, grabbing him by the left shoulder. The laughter died in Prahlad's throat and turned into a panicked scream of terror. His sudden descent into the lion's den was more of a shock for the animals than anything else, and the lion's jaws merely glanced off Prahlad's shoulder, not taking hold fully. Prahlad, bleeding, screaming, and utterly hysterical with pain and fear, attempted to run. He actually made it to the nearest tree, but before he could even get to the lowest branches, a claw hooked his ankle, yanking him off the trunk and sending him skidding through the grass and sand. That lion wasn't even hungry. It was well fed, and in the middle of the day, it was at its laziest and least likely to strike. But when a warm, living body falls from the sky, what else is a predator to do but chase it down? The guard didn't even make it to the fence line before Prahlad's screams were cut short. The animal grabbed him by the throat again. This time his bite was fatal. The jaws bore down so hard that Prahlad's neck was broken before he could suffocate or bleed out. Those cats, still full from their morning meal, didn't even bother to eat at him, but they did stand guard over their kill for 2 hours until a park worker was able to coax them with food into a treatment cell off to the side. By the time authorities could get inside to remove the body, Prahlad was in pieces. The cats hadn't really eaten him, but they did use those 2 hours to play, and play with his corpse they sure did. The coroner had to collect shards and scraps of bone spread out in an 8-foot radius around the body. The parks kept the male lion off in the holding cages for observation, but so far he hasn't shown any signs of unusual aggression, except frustration for being kept in the cramped temporary cages reserved for sick and injured animals. They've been adamant that they won't kill the lion. The only crime that was committed here was the unbelievably foolish actions committed by Prahlad. They plan on letting him out after 2 months, at which time the lion will be free to join his girls again and hopefully live a more peaceful life in his spacious, permanent accommodations. Considering how unlikely it would be that someone else like Prahlad Gujar would sneak into its cage, he will probably be the only one the lion brings to his terrifying final affliction. David Juel was an entrepreneur. He was also an adventurer and an avid kite surfer. Born and raised in Australia, he decided to move to Switzerland, where he had spent more than 12 years before one fateful holiday trip. He had started up several dining establishments in the Swiss ski region of Villars-Grillon, which included a restaurant, deli, cafe, and gourmet burger bar. David's aim was to introduce a taste of Australia to the locals and ski visitors high up in the Swiss Alps. Each of his establishments had become a huge success over the years, and David had been accepted into the Swiss community. If ever there was a problem, locals would turn to David, and he would be happy to help out. He was described as a pillar of the community, but tragically, all of that was to come crashing down when David took an adventurous vacation. In September 2016, David headed to New Caledonia, situated 750 miles east of Australia in the southwest Pacific Ocean. He had signed up for a Northern Reef Adventures kitesurfing trip from September 5th to 14th with adventure business company called Offshore Odyssey. It was to be an incredible trip. New Caledonia is a secluded island chain. It has been isolated since it broke off from Antarctica during the Mesozoic era, making it a unique refuge for numerous species of flora and fauna. But in its surrounding waters, the same predators that lurk just off the Australian coast also lurk off New Caledonia. Tiger sharks and great whites are common predators, hunting in the fish-rich seas and amongst the coral reefs. David boarded the Discovery catamaran. It was 56 feet long and 36 feet wide and had sailed the region many times before. The itinerary was packed full of adventure, sun, sea, and sand, and offered cultural experiences along the way. On one of the first days of the trip, the catamaran anchored up inside a reef just off the coastline of Comac in North Caledonia. David and some of the other passengers donned their wetsuits and took to their kiteboards. The crystal-clear waters around the reef were inviting. The weather was sunny, and the wind was perfect. It caught David's kite and immediately sent him across the turquoise blue water. He glided effortlessly over the surface. The wavelets began to build as he headed out over the reef and towards the open ocean, away from the catamaran. He pulled on the handles and lifted himself up off the water. The wind was in his hair. He felt the salt spray on his face as he surfed out over the reef and back again. But there was something below the surface, hidden by the sunshine glistening on the water. It was a shadowy figure, a predator that was capable of leaping more than 10 feet out of the water. Nothing was safe, either below or above the water. A tiger shark was prowling the edge of the reef. It was searching along the line of the coral for fish to eat. It crossed over into the shallower water, right where David was kite surfing. It sensed the vibrations from the kiteboard as it skimmed across the surface and came in for a closer look. It could see the image of David above it, and its natural hunting instincts kicked in. It powered through the water, propelling itself forward with its powerful tail. Its eyes were locked onto its target, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, David leapt into the air after another gust of wind. He landed with a splash and fell over in the water. The lines of the kite became slack and it came crashing down. Whilst David bobbed about in the sea, his feet still secured in the kiteboard straps, the shark came in for the kill. It swam up through the water column and opened its jaws wide just feet from David. It crashed into him and he was sent flying through the water. It felt like he was hit by a bus, a 3.5-meter long bus. The shark clamped its teeth around his right thigh, securing him in a vice-like grip. David screamed out. The serrated teeth sliced through skin, muscle, and blood vessels, causing catastrophic damage. Those on board the boat saw the dark gray back of the tiger shark arch out of the water. They saw the swirling commotion in the sea and the water bubbling, boiling, and foaming all around him. Seconds later, the shark released its grip and swam away out towards the reef. David was left with a gaping wound in his right leg. Blood poured into the ocean, and the crew on the catamaran immediately raced to help him. He was now surrounded in a cloud of dark red. There was a fear that the terrifying shark would come back, enticed by the fresh blood trailing in the sea. The crew on board the Discovery pulled him out of the water and tried to stem the bleeding, but David was losing too much blood. He was losing consciousness fast, and it was a race against time. They put out a distress call at 3:48 that afternoon, and rescue crews responded immediately. David was rushed to the port of Cormac, but on the way he suffered from a heart attack. Despite their best efforts at reviving him, when David arrived at 5 p.m., he was pronounced dead by a doctor. It was a terrible loss for David's friends and family, and a huge shock for those who had witnessed the attack. David was just 50 years old. The attack had come out of nowhere. David had been enjoying one of his favorite pastimes, and as chance would have it, he fell into the water within yards of the shark that was actively hunting at the time. Rather than swim away with the commotion of David landing in the water, it turned on him as an opportunistic hunter. David was well known and well liked within the kiteboarding circle, which was a very close-knit community. He was the fourth person to be attacked and the second to be killed by a shark in New Caledonia in the previous 6 months. There has been concern over the rising number in human-shark encounters around the islands. Some blame the warmer seas, an increased number of people taking to the water and enjoying water sports. Others blame overfishing and a lack of typical prey for sharks. And others suggest that the smells on human activities such as pollution, sewage, and food waste being emptied into the sea along the coastlines entice the sharks closer to shore. Whatever the reason, the rise in shark attacks several years later in 2023 prompted action by local officials. In less than a month, 3 people were attacked in Noumea, the capital of New Caledonia. The beaches in Noumea were mostly closed, and shark culls began earlier in the year. It wasn't just locals who were being attacked. Tourists had also been taken by sharks in the area. With tourism generating a significant amount of revenue for the islands, taking action was seen as the only way of protecting that. New Caledonia ranked as 13th on the list of countries with the most shark attacks. Something needed to be done. But the methods chosen for tackling the problem weren't popular. Not only were sharks culled in the waters, but local officials also planned to install a 750-meter metal net at Baie des Citrons. This would act as an underwater fence to protect swimmers and bathers from the sharks. But locals were outraged at the measures being taken. Regulars to the beaches loved snorkeling in the bays. The marine biodiversity was incredible, and being top of the ecosystem, sharks were vital in maintaining that. The net would prevent the likes of dugongs and sea turtles from entering the bay and was likely to damage the coral reef. Although the new technology used to make the net was designed to minimize unintentional bycatch, there were still concerns over its ethical use. Not only did marine biologists claim that culling sharks rarely worked, the animals were incredibly important for the indigenous Kanak culture, who protected the sharks rather than hunting them. In some parts of the world, marine nets prove unsustainable and ineffective. Perhaps other measures need to be taken instead, such as addressing the huge number of fishing boats that pour liters of fishing juice into the bays every day. Many believe the sewage system also contributes to making this area of the world a shark attack hotspot. Despite these frequent attacks, people will still risk their lives to enjoy the ocean, accepting the risk that they too will meet their terrifying final affliction. 26-year-old Sean Cole had been invited to a 30th birthday party. It was being held in the Mary River Wilderness Retreat, halfway between Australia's Darwin and Kakadu National Park. Sean headed more than 70 miles from his home in Darwin, where he worked as an IT expert. The group, consisting of about 15 people, were enjoying their time at the retreat. It was a popular outback tourist destination, but lying alongside the Mary River, it could be considered a dangerous place for people to party. On the Saturday afternoon, Sean and his friend made their way down the riverbank. Their group of friends followed them, watching from a safe distance. There was also a boat hovering in the water just upstream. Sean and his friend had a plan. They were going to try and swim across the river. Whether they were fueled by alcohol or the desire to prove themselves, the decision to enter the water was foolhardy. Employees of the retreat warned the party not to go near the water. Signs erected along the riverbank cautioned visitors about the dangers of crocodiles, But Sean and his friend ignored these warnings. Many times before, visitors had braved the river and lived to tell the tale. But the spot where Sean was entering, at a place called Anaburu, was infested with saltwater crocodiles. In fact, it is considered to have the highest concentration of saltwater crocodiles in the world. A survey that had been conducted 3 weeks previously at that spot recorded 4 crocodiles over 4 meters, 13 feet in length, and 12 measuring more than 3 meters, 10 feet. Amongst cheers from their friends, Sean and the other man jumped into the water and began to swim across the river. It was 180 meters wide. They kicked along the surface, making slow progress towards the other side. For a moment, it looked as though luck was on their side. Both friends made it to the other bank and turned to swim back again. Dr. Graham Webb, a crocodile expert, said that swimming in the Mary River came with almost a 100% chance of being taken by one of the enormous reptiles. Those that entered the water were dancing with death. But in the case of Sean and his friend, it seemed that alcohol may have played a role in their foolish decision. The two of them grinned at each other as they made their way back to the other side of the river. They could see their friends standing just 180 meters away. The adrenaline was pumping not just for the two men in the water, but for those who looked on. Everyone knew the risks, but they were having fun, and they let their guard down. Sean's friend pulled away and he took the lead, whilst Sean trailed behind. The people in the boat turned around to see the two men making their way back to the bank, but they saw something else in the water as well. It looked as though there were 3 people making the perilous journey, but as they shielded their eyes from the glare of the sun which shimmered off the water's surface, they were horrified to see that the third figure wasn't a person. It was the enormous head of a crocodile, and it was swimming after the two friends. It made a bow wave as it headed directly for the 2 young partygoers. Neither of the swimmers knew what was behind them until their friends began shouting at them. Sean was breathing heavily now from the effort of the swim, but things were about to get a whole lot worse. When he heard his friends shouting, at first he thought they were joking, but then he saw them panic. He glanced behind him and saw the knobbly head just a few feet away. It was huge, and it was clearly intent on taking one of them. Sean kicked furiously, trying to get away from the crocodile, but suddenly the terrifying head of the crocodile came around to his side, and his friends watched in absolute horror as it grabbed Sean in its jaws. It closed its razor-sharp teeth around his chest, and he gasped. It jerked its head backwards, and Sean was instantly spun around violently in a death roll. His friend saw a blur of action as reptile and human intertwined. Whilst the water splashed all around them, they saw glimpses of Sean between the turbulent water and the dark green-gray skin of the reptile. A moment later, and he disappeared beneath the surface. His friend screamed. The other swimmer reached the bank unharmed and ran up to safety. He was terrified and looked back, panting hard from the exertion and the fear. The water where Sean had been taken was now perfectly still, as if nothing had ever happened. The river continued to flow past the shocked group of friends without a trace of Sean or the crocodile. They called the emergency services while scouring the water for any sign of Sean. Sean was dragged down to the depths of the water. The crocodile never eased its grip around his chest. He had grappled with the animal whilst being disoriented as he was tossed and turned through the water. He held his breath as long as he could, but as the seconds ticked by, so too did his energy. Clamping down with a bite force of 3,700 psi, thought to be the strongest in the whole animal kingdom, Sean felt his chest being crushed under the pressure. Only seconds after being taken by the predator, Sean was gone. He had been foolish, but he hadn't deserved to die in that manner. For his friends, though, the ordeal wasn't over. They stood on the riverbank, traumatized by what they had just witnessed, but then they spotted something truly harrowing. Minutes after Sean had disappeared, the crocodile re-emerged on the surface of the river. It was swimming upstream, with Sean's limp body still held in its jaws. After it swam past them, it disappeared from sight once more. When emergency services arrived on scene, a search was mounted, which included the Water Police, Territory Response Group, Parks and Wildlife, and the Northern Territory Emergency Service. A large crocodile near the search area was immediately shot for the safety of the search team. The search for Sean continued into the evening. A number of large crocodiles were spotted in the area, but there was no way of telling if they were responsible. Sean's family were informed of the tragedy and traveled to the location. They were walked through the scene by police officers. It was incredibly distressing for all involved. When friends, who weren't there to witness the attack, heard of the incident, they were shocked. They said that it was completely out of character for Sean. He was usually the sensible one. In fact, they would have predicted anyone else in their circle of friends to have taken that risk, other than Sean. It wasn't until the third day that Sean's body was found. It was floating in the river, just 200 meters from where the attack had happened. Either the crocodile had stashed his body, which had now bobbed up to the surface, or the crocodile had released it, possibly due to the commotion of all the motorboats in the area. The coroner's report hasn't been released, but police couldn't tell if Sean had died from drowning or from his chest being crushed. Very close to where Sean was found, a menacing-looking 4.7-meter, 15-foot crocodile was lurking just 100 meters away. It was likely to be the culprit. Officials took aim and shot the predator, along with 3 others in the area. It was a way of giving the grieving family some form of closure. Some culls occur in Australian waterways to take out what are considered problem crocodiles. Every year, between 220 and 240 are removed from the wild. Their numbers have exploded since the ban on hunting in the 1970s. There are extensive educational programs that have been rolled out across Australia, warning locals of the dangers of the water. However, in some places, like the Mary River Wilderness Retreat, guests are often transient. Some visitors are from overseas and are not aware of the risk when wading into the rivers. But for Sean and his friends, they were considered local by Australian standards. They knew that crocodiles inhabited the water, and yet they still took the risk. Tragically, this led to Sean Cole meeting his terrifying final affliction. Thomas Smiley was finally able to enjoy his holiday home on the Hawaiian island of Maui. He and his wife Gail had been visiting the island for more than 14 years. His children and grandchildren spent many happy vacations there. Now, having retired the year before, Thomas was able to spend extended periods of time at Ka'anapali Shores in their condominium. Although Thomas was an extremely motivated man, having enjoyed a successful career as an optometrist in California, he was a family man at heart. He and Gail were high school sweethearts and had been married for 42 years. He had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Thomas had owned 2 optometry practices with his business partner, and his hard work had now afforded him the luxury of spending quality time with his family. In May 2019, Thomas and Gail had traveled from their home in California's Granite Bay to Maui once again. They tried to spend as much time there as possible. Their friends and family had joined them multiple times before. Now, as their trip to Hawaii was drawing to a close, Thomas decided to take one final dip in the ocean. Thomas was an adventurous individual who enjoyed the sea. He was a proficient water skier and introduced his grandchildren to the sport. His best friend since 1976, Gary Texera, described Thomas as living at 1,000,000 miles per hour. His other passion was muscle cars, which he drove on tracks across the U.S. Although Thomas was 65, no one would ever know it, as he was so young at heart and still full of adventure. When visiting Hawaii, Thomas went scuba diving most days. He was an experienced diver, and the waters of Maui were great for spotting all kinds of marine wildlife. However, on that fateful day, Thomas didn't go out for a dive. Because he and Gail were due to fly home the next day, and you are not allowed to dive within 24 hours of flying, he decided instead to go for a swim in the ocean. He waded into the water right in front of the condo that the pair owned. Whenever Thomas wasn't out on the dive boats, he would regularly swim from that particular beach. It was so convenient being right next to their apartment, and it was a lovely stretch of coastline. Often Gail would look out over the beach and see her husband swimming in the water. That morning was no different. But officials at the Department of Land and Natural Resources had made a terrible mistake. Over the past few weeks, they had been tracking a tiger shark in the area. It was part of their research, determining the routes it took and the miles it covered each day. It had been tracked to the beautiful stretch of coastline where Thomas now took his swim. No warning signs had been erected on the beaches to alert people to the tiger shark's presence. If there had, then Gail believes that there is no way Thomas would have entered the water that morning. It was supposed to be the final swim of the holiday. It turned out to be Thomas's final swim, period. Thomas swam parallel to the beach about 60 yards out. There were others in the water and people walking along the beach. It was a typical morning on Maui when all of a sudden Thomas felt a shark tug on his left leg and was instantly pulled under the water. In the few seconds that followed, he wasn't sure what happened. Then came the terrifying realization that he was being attacked by a shark. It was a tiger shark, and not just a tiger shark. It was the tiger shark that had been tracked by wildlife experts. It shook its head furiously from side to side, and Thomas was whipped through the water with it. He scrambled for the surface and took in a lungful of air before crying out for help. His cries were heard by those on the beach who turned to watch the terrifying attack unfold. His cries were also heard by Gail. She was in the condo. She stepped outside the doors and looked out over the water. When she had heard the cries, she assumed that a snorkeler had spotted a sea turtle and was shouting out of excitement, as had happened many times before. But when she looked out over the water, she saw a commotion. There was somebody splashing about, shouting as they bobbed under the water again and again. Gail's immediate thought was that somebody was in trouble with the currents and struggling to swim. At least it wasn't Thomas, because he was a very proficient swimmer, she thought. She could see members of the public standing on the beach, pointing out at the swimmer. Tragically, however, unbeknown to Gail, she was watching her husband being devoured by a large tiger shark. It continued to pull Thomas under the surface, and he tried to punch it and kick it with his other leg. His wrist was ripped to shreds as he lashed out again and again at the enormous beast. It was merciless in its attack. The hundreds of sharp, serrated teeth tore into Thomas's leg, and he felt the pressure building. He needed to break free. He needed to get out of the water, but nobody was coming for him. Eyewitnesses just stood and watched. Those on the beach could see the trouble he was in. Nobody wanted to risk getting into trouble themselves. Some had seen a fin arching out of the water, and it was now clear that the man in trouble was being attacked by a shark. Entering the water to help would be suicide. Somebody called the emergency services. No lifeguards had been stationed along that stretch of water. They had been too far away to respond immediately, but finally police jet skis were scrambled to the location. As they motored through the water, the salt spray flying into the air, Thomas felt his leg give way. The shark had completely bitten his leg off below the knee and swam away with it. Blood poured from his severed leg, and Thomas began losing consciousness. He had fought an incredibly brave battle. He had tried to fend the shark off, but the shark had been too powerful. Some tiger sharks can grow over 5 meters, 16 feet, and have a bite force of more than 300 psi. They rely on their serrated teeth to tear meat from their prey rather than their bite force to clamp down on it. But with that single bite and reluctance to let go, the shark had torn off Thomas's leg. He floated on the surface of the sea, surrounded by darkened water from his own blood. When the jet skis finally arrived, they pulled Thomas out of the water and rushed him to shore. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were closed, and he didn't move. The police jet skis powered up onto the sandy beach, skidding to a halt. Gail was still watching the drama unfolding, still unsure of what had happened to this poor swimmer. As she brought her hand up to her forehead to shield her eyes against the bright sunshine, her heart missed a beat. She noticed that the swimmer they carried to the sand was wearing Thomas's swimsuit. It was her husband. Gail raced down the stairs and out onto the beach. She screamed as she ran towards the crowd that had gathered. An ambulance was already on scene, and Thomas was loaded up onto a stretcher. Gail reached his lifeless body. First responders were performing CPR on Thomas, but he was pale all over. The lower half of his leg was missing, and one of his wrists was torn open where he had tried to fend the shark off. He had lost too much blood in such a short space of time. There was no bringing him back. It was a terrible incident, and so sad for those who knew Thomas. As the family tried to come to terms with Thomas's tragic death, it was hard to comprehend life without him. He had been such a rock for the family and was simply adored by his 6 grandchildren. He had lived life to his fullest, seeking adrenaline in the sports that he loved, and peace from the loving family he had been surrounded by. Thomas was the 6th person to be attacked by a shark in Hawaii that year, although, sadly, he was the only fatality. The last recorded death by a shark off Maui was 8 years earlier, back in 2015 when a snorkeler was killed. Thomas had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had he entered the water half an hour earlier or later, the shark wouldn't have been where he had been swimming. It was a tragic incident, and one that could have been avoided had people been warned about the tiger shark in the area. Instead, Dr. Thomas Smiley met his terrifying final affliction.